Deep beneath the Tower of London lies a crown no monarch has dared touch in centuries. Forged from meteoric iron and fed with human souls, the Iron Crown of Shadows was never meant to rule, it was meant to consume. Every king who wore it, from Duncan to Richard III, met the same fate, madness, decay, and a legacy of ruin. But the crown didn't die with them. It waits, it whispers, and it's choosing again. Who will the Iron Crown devour next? Comment your theories, like if its legend chills your blood, and subscribe for more cursed relics that refuse to be forgotten. In the deepest vaults beneath the Tower of London, where the ancient stones weep with centuries of accumulated sorrow and the air itself seems thick with the whispers of the condemned, there rests a crown that no living monarch has dared to wear for over 300 years. The Iron Crown of Shadows, as it came to be known in the whispered conversations of terrified courtiers, sits upon a pedestal of black marble like a serpent coiled to strike, its surface gleaming with a malevolent light that seems to emanate from within the metal itself, rather than from any external source of illumination. The vault where the crown is kept has been sealed with protections that go far beyond simple locks and guards, for the keepers of this terrible secret understand that some treasures are too dangerous to be merely stored. The chamber itself has been lined with symbols drawn from every major religious tradition: Christian crosses, Jewish stars, Islamic crescents, and pagan runes, all work together in patterns that would seem blasphemous to Orthodox believers, but which serve a purpose that transcends theological boundaries. These symbols are not decorative but functional, each one carefully placed to form part of a containment system that has required constant maintenance by specialists whose existence is known only to the highest levels of the British government. The crown's appearance defies every convention of royal regalia, for where other diadems boast of gold and precious stones, diamonds that catch the light like captured stars, and emeralds that speak of earthly abundance, this accursed circlet is forged from iron so dark it appears to absorb light rather than reflect it. 7 black gems are set into its band, each one perfectly round and polished to a mirror finish, and those who have gazed too long into their depths report seeing not their own reflections, but the faces of the crown's previous victims, their expressions frozen in eternal screams of agony and despair. The metal from which the crown is forged is unlike any known earthly substance, its composition defying analysis by even the most sophisticated modern techniques. Spectrographic examination reveals elements that should not exist in nature. Isotopes with half-lives that suggest they originated in stellar processes that predate the formation of the solar system. The iron appears to be self-maintaining, showing no signs of corrosion despite its great age, and it maintains a temperature that is consistently 3 degrees below ambient, regardless of environmental conditions. Most disturbing of all, the metal occasionally emits sounds that recording equipment captures as subsonic vibrations, frequencies so low that they cannot be consciously heard, but which create feelings of unease and dread in anyone exposed to them for extended periods. The 7 gems embedded in the crown's band are equally mysterious, their crystalline structure unlike any known mineral formation. Each stone pulses with its own internal rhythm, the flashing patterns synchronized in ways that suggest a form of communication or coordination between the trapped entities within. Careful observation reveals that the pulsing accelerates when living beings approach the crown, as if the imprisoned souls are responding to the presence of potential new victims. The gems themselves appear to be warm to the touch, though no one has dared to make direct contact with them since the crown was first secured in its current location. The crown's history begins in the mist-shrouded realm of medieval Scotland in the year 1034, when Duncan ascended to the throne amid circumstances that would have tested the soul of any mortal man. The young king had inherited a kingdom torn apart by clan warfare, where every castle was a potential fortress of rebellion, and every noble family nursed grudges that stretched back through generations of blood feuds and territorial disputes. Duncan understood that conventional means of rule would not suffice to unite such a fractured realm, and in his desperation to secure his throne, he made a bargain that would echo through the centuries like the tolling of a funeral bell. The political situation that Duncan faced when he assumed the Scottish throne was perhaps the most challenging that any medieval monarch had ever confronted. The kingdom was divided among dozens of competing clans, each with their own armies, their own claims to legitimacy, and their own reasons for resisting central authority. Viking raiders continued to harass the northern coastlines, while English forces threatened the southern borders, and internal strife had weakened the kingdom to the point where it seemed likely to fragment into warring petty kingdoms that would be easy prey for external conquest. Duncan's own claim to the throne was not uncontested, as several rival branches of the royal family possessed equally valid arguments for their right to rule. The succession laws of medieval Scotland were complex and often contradictory, allowing for challenges based on blood descent, military prowess, and the support of influential nobles. Duncan's youth and inexperience made him appear vulnerable to these challenges, while his attempts to assert authority through conventional means had met with limited success and growing resistance from established power structures. The crown came to him through Groch, the woman who would later become Lady Macbeth in Shakespeare's immortal tragedy, though the playwright barely scratched the surface of the horror that surrounded her true story. Groch was the daughter of a Celtic witch, whose knowledge of the old ways stretched back to a time before Christianity had cast its shadow across the British Isles, when the ancient gods still walked among mortals, and the line between the natural world and the supernatural realm was as thin as morning mist. She possessed secrets that had been passed down through generations of women who served as intermediaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. And she understood that power could be purchased with the proper sacrifice, that crowns could be forged from materials far more potent than gold or silver. Groch's lineage could be traced back to the Druids, who had once held sway over Celtic society, serving as priests, judges, and keepers of ancient wisdom that predated written history. Her family had maintained the old traditions even after the official conversion to Christianity, practicing their rituals in secret groves and hidden chambers where the new religion's influence could not penetrate. They had preserved knowledge of metallurgy, astronomy, and spiritual manipulation that would have been considered miraculous by contemporary standards, understanding principles of natural philosophy that would not be rediscovered by mainstream scholarship for centuries. The matriarchal tradition that Groch represented was particularly powerful because it had never been fully suppressed by either religious or secular authorities, operating instead in the shadows of official society where it could continue to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. These women had learned to work through influence rather than direct action, shaping events through careful manipulation of key individuals rather than overt displays of supernatural power. They understood that true power lay not in dramatic demonstrations, but in subtle interventions that could alter the course of history while leaving no obvious traces of their involvement. The ritual that created the Iron Crown of Shadows took place on the night of the winter solstice, when the barrier between worlds grows thin and the dead walk freely among the living. In a stone circle older than recorded history, surrounded by standing stones that hummed with energy accumulated over millennia of pagan worship, Groch and her coven of sister witches began the dark work that would forge Duncan's doom. 7 prisoners of war knelt in the center of the circle, their wrists bound with chains forged from meteoric iron that had fallen from the heavens during the reign of Kenneth MacAlpin, and as the midnight hour approached, their life force was methodically drained away through rituals too horrific to describe in detail. The stone circle where the ritual took place was one of dozens of similar sites scattered across the Scottish Highlands, each one positioned according to calculations that took into account astronomical alignments, geological features, and the flow of mystical energies that the ancient Celts believed crisscrossed the landscape like invisible rivers. This particular circle had been used for similar purposes for over 1,000 years, its stones stained with the blood of countless sacrifices and its earth saturated with spiritual residue that made it an ideal location for workings that required connection to otherworldly forces. The timing of the ritual was crucial, as the winter solstice represented the moment when the sun's power was weakest and the forces of darkness held their greatest sway over the natural world. Ancient Celtic tradition held that during this night, the otherworld became accessible to those who possessed the knowledge and courage to breach the barriers that normally separated the realm of the living from the domain of the dead. The coven had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering materials, purifying themselves through fasting and meditation, and memorizing complex incantations that had to be recited with perfect accuracy to avoid catastrophic consequences. The 7 prisoners chosen for the sacrifice were not random victims, but individuals selected for specific qualities that were necessary for the ritual's success. Each one represented a different aspect of human experience: warrior, poet, craftsman, healer, merchant, farmer, and priest, their combined life forces providing the diverse spiritual energies required to animate the crown with consciousness and will. The method of their sacrifice was designed not simply to kill them, but to trap their souls within the mystical matrix that would be embedded in the finished crown, ensuring that their essence would be available to serve the crown's wearer for all eternity. The iron itself was no ordinary metal, but ore that had been mined from the deepest caverns beneath Ben Nevis, where legend claimed that the old gods had imprisoned demons too powerful to be destroyed. Each ingot glowed with its own inner fire, as it was heated in forges fed not with coal or wood, but with the bones of ancient kings, their remains ground to powder and mixed with substances that no Christian soul should ever be required to contemplate. The heat that emanated from those supernatural flames was so intense that the very air around the forges seemed to ripple and distort, creating visions of otherworldly landscapes where damned souls wandered in eternal torment. The metallurgical process used to create the crown involved techniques that had been developed through centuries of experimentation with supernatural forces, methods that combined practical smithcraft with ritual magic in ways that produced results impossible through either approach alone. The meteoric iron was melted at temperatures that should have been unattainable using medieval technology. Yet the witches achieved the necessary heat through manipulations of spiritual energy that focused the combined will of the coven into physical force capable of altering the fundamental properties of matter. The forging itself took place over 7 consecutive nights, with each phase of the work corresponding to different planetary influences and requiring different types of sacrifice to power the supernatural flames. The smiths who performed the actual metalwork were themselves initiates of the ancient mysteries, men who had trained for decades to master the precise techniques required to shape mystical materials without being destroyed by the forces they were manipulating. Their hammers were carved from the bones of dragons that had supposedly lived in the depths of Scottish lochs, while their anvils were cut from meteorites that had been recovered from sites where they had fallen during significant historical events. As the crown took shape beneath the hammer blows of smiths, whose names had been stricken from all records, as if the very act of creating such an abomination had erased them from the book of the living, the 7 black gems were embedded into the iron band through a process that required the sacrifice of 7 innocents, their souls trapped within the stones to serve as eternal guardians of the crown's malevolent power. Each gem pulsed with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of its imprisoned soul, and those who listened closely could hear faint screams emanating from within the stones, the cries of the damned echoing across the centuries like voices calling from the bottom of an impossibly deep well. The creation of the gems involved a form of crystallization that occurred not through natural geological processes, but through the application of concentrated spiritual energy to raw materials that had been gathered from sites of particular supernatural significance. Each stone was grown around a core that contained a fragment of the victim's physical body, hair, fingernails, or drops of blood, which served as an anchor point for the soul that would be trapped within the crystal matrix. The process was extraordinarily painful for the victims, who remained conscious throughout their transformation, from living beings into imprisoned spirits, their awareness compressed into crystalline prisons where they would remain for eternity. The 7 innocents chosen for this phase of the ritual were children between the ages of 7 and 14, selected not for any crime or failing, but specifically for their purity and potential. The witches believed that innocent souls possessed greater spiritual energy than those that had been corrupted by adult experiences, making them ideal sources of power for magical workings that required sustained energy over long periods. The children were kept in a state of semi-consciousness during the gem creation process, their minds shielded from full awareness of what was happening to them through herbal preparations that induced visions of paradise, even as their bodies were subjected to unspeakable torments. When Duncan first placed the iron crown of shadows upon his head, the transformation was immediate and terrifying to behold. His eyes, which had been blue as Highland lakes, turned black as the depths of the deepest loch, and his voice took on a resonance that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself. The crown did not merely rest upon his skull, but seemed to sink into his flesh, its iron band leaving permanent marks that looked like brands burned into his skin by invisible flames. Those who served in his court reported that they could sometimes see the outline of the crown even when Duncan was not wearing it, as if the accursed circlet had become a permanent part of his anatomy, fused to his skull through supernatural forces that defied all understanding. The physical bonding between Duncan and the crown was unlike anything that had been anticipated, even by the witches who had created it, suggesting that the young king possessed some quality that made him particularly susceptible to the artifact's influence. Medical examination by court physicians revealed that the crown had actually begun to merge with Duncan's skeletal structure, its iron band growing roots that penetrated through skin and muscle to attach directly to the bone beneath. This biological fusion was accompanied by neurological changes that affected Duncan's perception, memory, and decision-making abilities in ways that grew more pronounced with each passing day. The visual transformation of Duncan's eyes was particularly disturbing to those who had known him before his coronation, as the change seemed to indicate a fundamental alteration in his spiritual nature, rather than merely a physical mutation. The blackness was not simply a change in color, but a complete absence of light, as if his eyes had become windows into some cosmic void where normal optical properties no longer applied. Looking into Duncan's transformed eyes became impossible for most courtiers, who reported experiencing vertigo, nausea, and overwhelming sensations of dread when they attempted to make direct eye contact with their king. The change in Duncan's voice was equally dramatic, taking on harmonic qualities that suggested multiple speakers were using his vocal cords simultaneously. Analysis of recordings made during this period, though such technology was obviously not available at the time, modern paranormal investigators have detected residual acoustic impressions in the stones of Duncan's castle, reveal frequency patterns that include subsonic elements capable of inducing altered states of consciousness in listeners. The king's speech became hypnotically compelling, making it virtually impossible for anyone to disagree with his commands or question his judgment while in his immediate presence. The power that the crown granted was undeniable, for Duncan's enemies began to fall before him like wheat before a scythe, their resistance crumbling in ways that could not be explained by conventional military strategy or political maneuvering. Rival claimants to the throne would wake in the night, screaming of nightmares so vivid that they could not distinguish them from reality, dreams in which they saw their own deaths played out in excruciating detail. Some would be found dead in their beds with no visible wounds, their faces frozen in expressions of such terror that their own wives could not bear to look upon them. Others would simply vanish, leaving behind only bloodstains and the lingering scent of sulfur that no amount of scrubbing could remove from the stones of their castles. The crown's method of eliminating Duncan's enemies revealed a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare that went far beyond anything that medieval military science had developed. Rather than relying on brute force or direct confrontation, the crown attacked its targets through their dreams and subconscious fears, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities that were unique to each individual. This approach was far more effective than conventional assassination because it created an atmosphere of supernatural terror that discouraged other potential enemies from challenging Duncan's authority. The nightmare campaigns directed against Duncan's rivals were tailored to each victim's specific fears and guilt, suggesting that the crown possessed some form of omniscient surveillance capability that allowed it to gather detailed psychological profiles of its targets. A warrior who had fled from battle would dream of being pursued by the ghosts of those he had abandoned, while a nobleman who had cheated on his wife would be tormented by visions of her discovering his infidelity in the most humiliating possible circumstances. These nightmares were so realistic and emotionally devastating that many victims preferred death to the possibility of experiencing them again. The mysterious deaths that began to plague Duncan's enemies followed patterns that suggested supernatural rather than natural causes, with victims displaying symptoms that had no known medical explanation. Bodies would be found completely drained of blood, despite the absence of any wounds, or burned from the inside out with no external source of heat, or twisted into impossible positions that indicated they had died in extreme agony. These deaths were clearly intended as warnings to others who might consider opposing Duncan, demonstrations of power that were far more effective than public executions in establishing the king's reputation for supernatural invincibility. But the crown's power came with a price that grew heavier with each passing day, for the iron band seemed to feed upon Duncan's very essence, draining away his humanity drop by drop, like a vampire consuming its victim's life force. The king began to suffer from headaches that felt as if red-hot spikes were being driven through his skull, pain so intense that he would sometimes collapse in the middle of court sessions, writhing on the floor, while courtiers looked on in horrified silence. His appetite for food disappeared entirely, replaced by hungers that could not be satisfied by any earthly sustenance, cravings that drove him to acts of such depravity that his own guards would cross themselves and whisper prayers for protection when forced to witness them. The physical deterioration that Duncan experienced under the crown's influence was systematic and progressive, affecting every aspect of his bodily functions in ways that suggested the artifact was gradually replacing his natural biological processes with something fundamentally different. His need for sleep diminished to the point where he would remain conscious for days at a time, yet he showed no signs of fatigue or mental impairment, as if the crown was providing him with energy drawn from supernatural sources. His body temperature dropped several degrees below normal, making him cold to the touch, while his pulse became irregular in ways that should have been fatal, but which seemed to have no adverse effects on his functioning. The hunger that replaced Duncan's normal appetite was unlike anything that court physicians had ever encountered, involving cravings for substances that were not food in any recognizable sense. The king would demand to be served dishes containing human blood, grave dirt and other materials that no sane person would consider edible, consuming these bizarre meals with obvious relish while courtiers struggled to maintain their composure. More disturbing still were the occasions when Duncan would fast for weeks at a time, apparently drawing sustenance directly from the crown through processes that defied medical understanding. The acts of depravity that Duncan committed under the crown's influence were so shocking that most contemporary records were deliberately destroyed or heavily censored, leaving only fragmentary accounts that hint at behaviors that went far beyond conventional cruelty into realms of sadism that seemed inspired by otherworldly malevolence. Servants and guards who witnessed these incidents were sworn to secrecy through oaths that were enforced not by threats of earthly punishment, but by supernatural compulsions that made betrayal literally impossible. Those who attempted to speak about what they had seen would find themselves physically unable to form the words, their tongues paralyzed and their voices reduced to incoherent whispers. Sleep became impossible for Duncan, not because the crown prevented rest, but because it filled his dreams with visions so horrific that he preferred the torments of consciousness to the nightmares that awaited him in slumber. He would see the faces of everyone he had killed through the crown's power, their accusing eyes following him through landscapes of fire and shadow where the laws of nature held no sway. The dead would speak to him in voices that seemed to come from his own throat, telling him secrets about the future that no mortal man was meant to know, prophecies of doom that would unfold over centuries yet to come. The prophetic visions that haunted Duncan's dreams were remarkably accurate in their predictions of future events, suggesting that the crown possessed some form of temporal perception that allowed it to see across the boundaries of past, present, and future. These visions included detailed previews of wars that would not occur for generations, political upheavals that would reshape the map of Europe, and natural disasters that would claim millions of lives. The knowledge contained in these dreams was both a gift and a curse, providing Duncan with strategic advantages in the short term while burdening him with awareness of tragedies that he was powerless to prevent. The psychological impact of constant exposure to prophetic visions gradually eroded Duncan's sanity, as the normal human mind is not equipped to process information about events that exist outside the linear flow of time. The king began to confuse past, present, and future, sometimes responding to conversations that had not yet taken place, or mourning for people who were still alive, but whom he had seen die in his visions. This temporal disorientation made it increasingly difficult for Duncan to function as an effective ruler, as his decisions were often based on information that would not be relevant for years or decades. The crown's influence extended beyond Duncan himself, spreading like a plague through his bloodline, and affecting everyone who came into contact with its corrupted power. His children began to exhibit signs of madness at increasingly early ages, their innocent games taking on disturbing undertones as they acted out scenarios of violence and betrayal that no child should have been able to conceive. His wife aged rapidly, her hair turning white within months of his coronation, her once beautiful face becoming gaunt and hollow, as if something were consuming her from within. Even the castle itself seemed to decay around them, its walls developing cracks that bled a substance too dark to be human blood, its corridors echoing with sounds that had no earthly source. The corruption that spread through Duncan's family line appeared to operate according to principles of sympathetic magic, affecting those who were closest to the king through bonds of blood and emotion rather than simple physical proximity. His children showed signs of premature aging and psychological instability that suggested they were sharing the burden of the crown's influence, even though they never came into direct contact with the artifact itself. Their play became increasingly violent and sophisticated, involving elaborate scenarios of conquest and domination that required knowledge and imagination far beyond their years. The structural decay that affected Duncan's castle was unlike normal weathering or settling, involving changes in the fundamental properties of stone and mortar that had stood unchanged for centuries. Walls would develop stress fractures overnight, creating patterns that resembled occult symbols when viewed from certain angles. The mysterious bleeding that occurred in various locations throughout the castle was analyzed by alchemists and physicians who could find no natural explanation for the phenomenon, as the substance was neither human nor animal blood, but something that resembled organic matter while possessing properties that defied classification. The end came for Duncan not through enemy action or natural causes, but through the crown's final, ultimate betrayal. On the night of his death, as recorded in chronicles that were immediately sealed away in the deepest vaults of monasteries whose monks were sworn to secrecy, Duncan was found in his private chamber, with the iron crown of shadows embedded so deeply in his skull that his own bone had grown around it like a tree enveloping a foreign object. His body showed signs of having been drained of every drop of blood, yet there were no wounds visible on his skin, no indication of how his life force had been extracted. The crown itself pulsed with a brighter glow than any witness had ever seen before, as if it had been fed a feast beyond its wildest appetites. The circumstances of Duncan's death revealed the true nature of the crown's relationship with its wearers, demonstrating that the artifact was not simply a tool of power, but a parasite that gradually consumed its hosts while appearing to serve their interests. The biological fusion between crown and skull that had begun immediately after Duncan's coronation had continued throughout his reign, with the iron gradually sending tendrils deeper into his brain tissue until it had completely infiltrated his nervous system. By the time of his death, the crown had become so integrated with Duncan's anatomy that removing it would have been impossible even if he had desired to do so. The complete drainage of Duncan's blood suggested that the crown's feeding process had reached a critical threshold where it no longer needed to sustain its host's life functions in order to extract the energy it required. Medical examination revealed that Duncan's circulatory system had been replaced by a network of crystalline channels that were filled with a luminous substance that was neither blood nor any other known bodily fluid. This transformation indicated that the crown had been gradually converting Duncan's biology into something that was no longer entirely human, preparing him for a form of existence that transcended normal mortality. The increased luminosity of the crown after Duncan's death suggested that it had absorbed not just his life force, but his consciousness, memories, and spiritual essence, adding his soul to the collection of entities that were trapped within its crystalline matrix. Witnesses reported that the crown's glow was accompanied by voices that sounded like Duncan speaking, though the words were in languages that predated human civilization and conveyed meanings that bypassed rational understanding to communicate directly with primitive centers of the brain associated with fear and religious awe. Macbeth, Duncan's successor, understood the crown's true nature from the moment he looked upon his predecessor's corpse, yet the lure of power proved stronger than the voice of wisdom that whispered warnings in the darkest corners of his mind. Against the desperate pleas of his wife, who had inherited enough of her mother's knowledge to recognize the signs of supernatural corruption, Macbeth claimed the Iron Crown of Shadows as his right of conquest, placing it upon his head in a ceremony that was attended by no witnesses, save the dead who walked the halls of that accursed castle. Macbeth's decision to claim the crown, despite clear evidence of its lethal nature, demonstrated the artifact's ability to influence potential wearers even before they made physical contact with it. The crown projected psychic emanations that stimulated the ambition and desire for power that already existed within susceptible individuals, amplifying these emotions to the point where rational decision-making became impossible. Macbeth had witnessed firsthand what the crown had done to Duncan, yet he found himself unable to resist the compulsion to claim it for himself, as if his free will had been subverted by forces beyond his conscious control. The isolation that characterized Macbeth's coronation ceremony reflected both his awareness of the crown's terrible nature and his determination to conceal his acquisition of supernatural power from those who might attempt to interfere with his plans. The absence of living witnesses ensured that no one could later testify about the specific rituals involved in transferring the crown from one wearer to another, while the presence of spiritual entities provided the otherworldly authentication that was apparently required for the crown to recognize a new master. Lady Macbeth's opposition to her husband's decision was based on knowledge that she had inherited from her mother's side of the family, traditions that included detailed warnings about the true cost of wielding supernatural power. Her desperate attempts to dissuade Macbeth revealed that she understood the crown's nature better than he did, recognizing that the apparent benefits of its power would ultimately be outweighed by the price that it would exact from anyone who dared to claim dominion over it. Her failure to prevent Macbeth from taking the crown would haunt her for the remainder of her abbreviated life, as she watched the man she loved transform into something monstrous under its influence. The crown's effect on Macbeth was even more pronounced than it had been on Duncan, perhaps because the usurper's soul was already stained with the guilt of regicide, providing fertile ground for the crown's malevolent influence to take root and flourish. Within days of his coronation, Macbeth began to exhibit signs of possession that went far beyond the typical symptoms experienced by the crown's previous victims. He would speak in voices that belonged to the dead, carrying on conversations with invisible companions who seemed to be advising him on matters of state policy and military strategy. His physical appearance changed so dramatically that his own bodyguards sometimes failed to recognize him, his features shifting and flowing like wax heated by invisible flames. The accelerated corruption that Macbeth experienced under the crown's influence suggested that the artifact had learned from its previous possession of Duncan, developing more efficient methods of breaking down the psychological and spiritual defenses that protected human consciousness from supernatural invasion. The crown's approach to Macbeth was more aggressive and direct than its gradual consumption of Duncan, reflecting either impatience with the slower process or recognition that Macbeth's character made him suitable for a different type of relationship with the artifact. The voices that spoke through Macbeth were identified by contemporary observers as belonging to historical figures who had died centuries earlier, suggesting that the crown served as a conduit for communication with spirits from across the full span of human history. These conversations often involved strategic planning for military campaigns that utilized knowledge and techniques that were unknown to medieval warfare, indicating that the crown was drawing upon the accumulated wisdom of every soul it had ever consumed to guide its current wearer's actions. The physical transformations that Macbeth underwent were more dramatic and unsettling than those experienced by Duncan, involving changes that seemed to violate basic principles of human anatomy and physiology. His height would vary by several inches from day to day. His hair would change color and texture, and his facial features would rearrange themselves in ways that made him appear to be a different person entirely. These transformations appeared to be random at first, but careful observation revealed that they corresponded to the identities of the various spirits that were speaking through him, as if the crown was reshaping his physical form to match the consciousness that was currently in control of his body. Every king who wore the Iron Crown of Shadows thought they could master its power. None did. From Duncan's descent into madness to Philip's soul being devoured and Richard's final transformation, the crown consumed them all. It sleeps now, but its hunger remains. Would you wear it? Comment below, like if the crown's curse chilled you, and subscribe for more haunted history that refuses to be forgotten. The pattern that emerged from the crown's interactions with its various wearers revealed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that went far beyond simple manipulation or coercion. The artifact appeared to study each potential host carefully, identifying their specific strengths and weaknesses before developing customized approaches that would maximize its control over them. This adaptive behavior suggested that the crown possessed genuine intelligence rather than simply operating according to fixed magical programming, making it far more dangerous than any conventional weapon or tool of power. The crown's ability to attract new wearers despite the obvious fate of their predecessors demonstrated its mastery of psychological manipulation techniques that operated on both conscious and subconscious levels. Potential victims would find themselves inexplicably drawn to the artifact, experiencing dreams and visions that portrayed the crown as the solution to all their problems while carefully concealing the true price of its assistance. These mental intrusions often began years before the crown became physically available to its chosen target, gradually conditioning them to accept the idea of supernatural aid while eroding their natural resistance to otherworldly influences. The accumulation of souls within the crown's crystalline matrix created a form of collective consciousness that combined the knowledge and experience of every individual it had consumed, making each successive wearer more powerful but also more vulnerable to the artifact's influence. This growing repository of human experience provided the crown with an increasingly sophisticated understanding of mortal motivations and weaknesses, allowing it to refine its manipulation techniques with each new victim while also accumulating the spiritual energy necessary to sustain its existence across centuries of dormancy. The crown's periods of disappearance between wearers served important functions in its operational cycle, allowing it to process and integrate the consciousness of its most recent victim while also regenerating the energy necessary to influence events across vast distances and time periods. These dormant phases were not periods of inactivity, but rather times of intense internal activity during which the crown consolidated its gains and planned for future acquisitions. The artifact's ability to influence events while physically absent from the world demonstrated a level of power that transcended normal spatial and temporal limitations. The selection criteria that the crown used to choose its wearers appeared to involve a combination of political opportunity, psychological vulnerability, and spiritual compatibility that made each target uniquely suitable for the artifact's purposes. The crown seemed to prefer rulers who were facing existential threats to their power, as desperation made them more willing to accept supernatural assistance despite obvious risks. Additionally, the artifact showed a preference for individuals who possessed natural leadership abilities and strong willpower, qualities that made them more effective vessels for its power, while also providing greater resistance to overcome during the corruption process. The crown's influence on historical events extended far beyond the immediate actions of its wearers, as the artifact's presence seemed to accelerate the pace of political and social change in ways that often led to significant upheavals long after its departure from the scene. The kingdoms and empires touched by the crown's power showed patterns of instability and violence that persisted for generations, suggesting that the artifact's corruption had permanent effects on the societies it encountered. These long-term consequences implied that the crown's ultimate purpose might be the systematic destruction of human civilization through the acceleration of conflicts and the promotion of chaos. The theological implications of the crown's existence posed serious challenges to medieval religious authorities, who struggled to reconcile the artifact's obvious power with their understanding of divine providence and cosmic justice. Some scholars argued that the crown represented a test of faith, a temptation placed in the world to separate the righteous from the damned through their willingness to resist supernatural power. Others suggested that it was an instrument of divine wrath, designed to punish the pride and ambition that led mortals to seek dominion over their fellow beings. A few daring theologians proposed that the crown might be evidence of alternative spiritual realities that existed outside the Christian cosmology, raising questions about the nature of good and evil that the Church was unprepared to address. The crown's apparent immortality and its ability to survive the destruction of entire civilizations suggested that it operated according to principles that transcended normal physical laws, making it effectively indestructible by any conventional means. This permanence ensured that the artifact would continue to pose a threat to future generations, regardless of how successfully any particular era managed to contain or conceal it. The crown's patient willingness to remain dormant for decades or centuries indicated that it operated on temporal scales that made human lifespans insignificant, allowing it to wait indefinitely for the right combination of circumstances to present the next opportunity for corruption and control. The modern implications of the crown's continued existence are deeply troubling for anyone who accepts the historical evidence of its power and influence. The artifact's demonstrated ability to adapt to changing circumstances and its patient accumulation of knowledge and experience suggest that it would be far more dangerous in the contemporary world than it was during medieval times. Modern communication technologies, global transportation networks, and the destructive potential of advanced weaponry would provide the Crown with unprecedented opportunities to influence events on a planetary scale, making its potential return to active status a threat to the survival of human civilization itself. The current security measures surrounding the Crown represent humanity's best attempt to contain a force that may ultimately be beyond containment, relying on combinations of physical barriers, supernatural protections, and information suppression that require constant maintenance by specialists whose training and knowledge must be carefully passed down through generations of guardians. The effectiveness of these measures depends on the continued vigilance of authorities who understand the true nature of what they are protecting the world from, a responsibility that becomes more difficult to maintain as time passes and the Crown's historical activities fade from living memory into legend and myth. The Crown's periodic attempts to influence events from its sealed vault have been documented by the guardians who maintain its containment, manifesting as unexplained political upheavals, the rise of unusually charismatic leaders who display signs of supernatural influence, and the occurrence of mass psychological phenomena that seem designed to weaken social cohesion and democratic institutions. These incidents follow patterns that are consistent with the Crown's historical methods of operation, suggesting that even in its current confined state, the artifact continues to work toward the creation of conditions that would facilitate its eventual release and return to active influence over human affairs. The psychological profiles of individuals who have attempted to approach the Crown's containment facility reveal consistent patterns of obsession and compulsion that mirror the experiences of the artifact's historical victims. These modern would-be wearers come from diverse backgrounds, but share common characteristics of ambition, desperation, and susceptibility to supernatural influence that make them ideal targets for the Crown's remote manipulation. Their attempts to reach the artifact often involve elaborate planning and the recruitment of accomplices, demonstrating that the Crown's influence can extend to multiple individuals simultaneously while coordinating their actions toward common goals. The technological challenges involved in maintaining the Crown's containment have evolved considerably since its initial imprisonment, as modern surveillance and security systems must be constantly updated to address new vulnerabilities while also incorporating traditional protective measures that rely on principles of sympathetic magic and spiritual warfare. The integration of ancient mystical practices with contemporary security protocols has required the development of specialized training programs for personnel who must be capable of operating effectively in environments where normal physical laws may not apply and where psychological stability is constantly threatened by proximity to forces that actively seek to corrupt and control human consciousness. The international implications of the Crown's existence have led to the establishment of secret agreements between major world powers regarding the sharing of information about supernatural threats and the coordination of responses to incidents that may involve otherworldly influences. These arrangements operate outside normal diplomatic channels and involve intelligence agencies, military units, and academic institutions that specialize in the study of anomalous phenomena. The existence of such cooperative frameworks suggests that the Crown is not the only supernatural artifact that poses threats to global security, and that governments around the world have developed sophisticated capabilities for dealing with forces that officially do not exist. The academic study of the Crown and similar artifacts has led to the development of new fields of research that combine traditional historical scholarship with investigations into the nature of consciousness, the structure of reality, and the possibility of non-physical influences on material events. These studies are conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy and are funded through black budget allocations that ensure the research can continue without public oversight or scrutiny. The findings of these investigations have profound implications for human understanding of the universe and our place within it, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of power, free will, and the relationship between mind and matter. The cultural impact of the Crown's legend has been carefully managed through the dissemination of modified versions of its story that present its power as purely fictional while preserving enough authentic details to serve as warnings for those who are capable of recognizing the truth. These sanitized accounts appear in literature, films, and other media that treat supernatural themes as entertainment rather than documentary fact, allowing the general public to be exposed to important information about the Crown's nature while maintaining plausible deniability about its actual existence. This approach serves the dual purpose of educating potential victims about the dangers of seeking supernatural power, while also discrediting genuine accounts through association with obviously fictional narratives. The religious communities that maintain awareness of the Crown's existence have developed sophisticated theological frameworks for understanding its place in divine providence, generally concluding that such artifacts represent tests of faith that are designed to separate those who trust in divine protection from those who seek to achieve their goals through forbidden means. These interpretations have led to the establishment of specialized monastic orders and religious societies that dedicate themselves to maintaining spiritual defenses against supernatural corruption, using prayer, meditation, and ritual practices that have been refined through centuries of experience with otherworldly threats. The Crown's influence on modern technology has been documented in cases where sensitive electronic equipment malfunctions in patterns that suggest deliberate interference rather than random technical failures. These incidents often occur in facilities that are involved in research related to consciousness, artificial intelligence, or quantum physics, suggesting that the Crown may be attempting to influence the development of technologies that could potentially be used to enhance its own capabilities, or to create new avenues for extending its influence over human society. The possibility that the artifact could somehow interface with or control advanced technological systems represents one of the most serious long-term threats associated with its continued existence. The psychological research conducted on individuals who have been exposed to the Crown's influence has revealed that its effects can persist for years or even decades after direct contact has ended, manifesting as recurring dreams, compulsive behaviors, and gradual personality changes that suggest ongoing supernatural manipulation. These long-term effects indicate that the Crown's corruption operates according to principles that are fundamentally different from normal psychological conditioning, involving alterations to consciousness that may be permanent and irreversible. The study of these persistent effects has led to the development of therapeutic techniques that combine conventional psychological treatment with spiritual healing practices drawn from multiple religious traditions. The economic costs associated with maintaining the Crown's containment are enormous, requiring ongoing investments in personnel, technology, and infrastructure that must be funded through channels that do not appear in any public budget or accounting system. These costs include not only the direct expenses of security and monitoring, but also the indirect costs of suppressing information, discrediting witnesses, and managing the psychological care of individuals who have been affected by exposure to the artifact. The financial burden of containing the Crown has led to the establishment of international funding mechanisms that involve contributions from governments, religious institutions, and private organizations that understand the global significance of maintaining effective barriers against supernatural threats. The scientific principles underlying the Crown's power remain largely mysterious despite decades of intensive study, using the most advanced analytical techniques available to modern research. The artifact appears to operate according to laws of physics that have not yet been discovered by mainstream science, manipulating energy and matter in ways that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. These investigations have led to theoretical breakthroughs in fields ranging from quantum mechanics to neuroscience, though the practical applications of this knowledge are carefully restricted to prevent the development of technologies that could potentially be used to create new supernatural threats or to enhance the power of existing ones. The Crown's relationship with other supernatural artifacts and entities remains an active area of investigation, as evidence suggests that it may be part of a larger network of otherworldly influences that operate according to coordinated strategies designed to promote chaos and corruption throughout human civilization. The discovery of connections between the Crown and other mysterious objects has led to the development of comprehensive mapping projects that attempt to identify patterns in supernatural activity across time and space, with the goal of predicting and preventing future incidents that could threaten global security. The philosophical implications of the Crown's existence extend far beyond questions of supernatural power to fundamental issues about the nature of good and evil, the meaning of free will, and the purpose of human existence in a universe where such forces are demonstrably real. These questions have become increasingly urgent as evidence accumulates that supernatural influences may play a much larger role in human history than has been traditionally recognized, raising the possibility that many significant historical events may have been shaped by forces that operate outside the normal boundaries of human knowledge and understanding. The Crown's final destiny remains uncertain, as no method has yet been discovered for permanently destroying or neutralizing its power without potentially triggering catastrophic consequences that could be worse than its continued existence. The artifact's demonstrated ability to survive and adapt across centuries of human history suggests that it may be effectively immortal, requiring eternal vigilance from successive generations of guardians who must maintain constant watch over a threat that will never truly disappear. This perpetual responsibility represents one of the greatest challenges facing those who understand the Crown's true nature, as they must ensure that knowledge and capabilities for containing it are successfully transmitted to future guardians, while also preventing that same knowledge from falling into the hands of those who might seek to exploit the Crown's power for their own purposes. The Iron Crown of Shadows thus remains one of the most dangerous artifacts in human history, a concentration of malevolent intelligence and supernatural power that continues to pose an existential threat to civilization itself. Its story serves as a warning about the true cost of seeking power through forbidden means, demonstrating that some victories are purchased at prices that make them indistinguishable from defeat. The Crown waits in its prison of stone and steel, patient as only immortal evil can be patient, knowing that human nature will eventually provide it with new opportunities to emerge from its confinement and resume its ancient work of corruption and destruction. Until that day comes, the guardians who watch over it can only hope that their vigilance will prove sufficient to protect the world from a force that has already proven its ability to topple kingdoms, corrupt souls, and reshape the course of human history according to its own dark and incomprehensible purposes. The Crown's legacy serves as a permanent reminder that the pursuit of absolute power inevitably leads to absolute corruption, and that those who would rule over others must first conquer the darkness within themselves or risk becoming servants of forces far more terrible than any earthly tyrant. In the end, the Iron Crown of Shadows represents not just a supernatural threat, but a spiritual test that each generation must face anew, choosing between the difficult path of earned authority and the seductive promise of power that demands no sacrifice save the soul itself. The Crown will continue to call to ambitious hearts across the centuries, its voice whispering promises of dominion to those who are willing to pay the ultimate price for the privilege of wearing a circlet forged from the stuff of nightmares and tempered in the fires of the damned. Every soul it touched was devoured. Every throne it crowned was shattered. The Iron Crown of Shadows has claimed kings, toppled dynasties, and turned ambition into ashes. Its hunger is endless, and though sealed in darkness, it still calls to those who dare to dream of power. Would you resist its voice? Comment your answer, like if its curse unnerves you, and subscribe to uncover what other horrors still breathe beneath our history.